our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Discipline is the soul of an army. It makes small numbers form, procures success to each.
First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Light Horse Harry Lee's words from the official eulogy of George Washington were once famous. Nowadays, we usually think of Washington as the granite figure on Mount Rushmore, or Gilbert Stuart's famous painting, solemn and distant. But at the time of the American Revolution, 43-year-old George Washington was in the prime of his life, battle-tested, strong and vigorous. At 6 foot 2 inches, he was a natural leader of men. Washington did not write the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, or the Federalist Papers. Yet his defiant, inspiring, and commanding writings far outweigh those of his contemporaries. As a military general, he lost more battles than he won. Yet Washington fearlessly led an untrained army to defeat the greatest military power in the world. If the Declaration of Independence was an expression of the American mind, as Jefferson called it, George Washington was its embodiment. He brought the Revolution's principles to life, and in doing so brought this country into being. This was the man who founded America. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, near Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. The first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. What he learned came mostly from self-study and practical experience. He knew the Bible and Shakespeare, read Seneca and Cicero, and studied history in the political writings of the day. As a young man, Washington was a surveyor and traveled extensively in the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted to join the British Navy, but his mother objected. At the age of 21, Washington sought a commission and was appointed by the British as a major in the militia. Later, as a lieutenant colonel, his regiment was sent to the Ohio Valley to challenge a French incursion. The resulting skirmishes marked the opening of the French and Indian War. Since he could advance no further in British ranks, being a colonial subject, Washington resigned his commission and instead volunteered as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to expel the French from Fort Duquesne. When they were ambushed and Braddock was mortally wounded, it was Washington, with 2 horses shot from under him and his clothes pierced by 4 musket balls, who rallied the panicked troops and formed a rear guard, allowing the remaining force to retreat. After that, he was appointed colonel of the Provincial Virginia Regiment, which made him the highest-ranking American military officer in the colony. In 1758, Washington was elected a member of the House of Burgesses. The next year, he married the young widow, Martha Custis, who would be his wife for the next 40 years. And they established their home at Mount Vernon. He served as a vestryman in their nearby Anglican parish. Washington had inherited slaves, and more came with his marriage. But he eventually opposed slavery, wished to see its abolition, and in his will, upon Martha's death, freed his slaves. As the colonial crisis heated up, Washington sponsored a series of resolutions denying the right of the British Parliament to tax the colonists, and along with George Mason, introduced the Fairfax Resolves, which closed Virginia's trade with England. In 1774, Washington was elected as a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. After election in Concord, Washington urged Congress to prepare for war. He attended sessions in his uniform to show that he was deadly serious. When Congress recognized the militia forces around Boston as a Continental Army, there was really no question who would be selected to command them. General Washington left Philadelphia just as news broke of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Once outside Boston, he immediately set out to force the British to battle or to leave, which they did after Washington had cannons placed on Dorchester Heights, threatening the British ships in Boston's harbor. Anticipating that the British would attack New York next, he swiftly moved his army there. It is often argued that Washington followed a Fabian strategy, modeled after the Roman general who defeated a superior enemy through a war of skirmishes and attrition. But Washington was also a bold general when the opportunity presented itself. After retreating across New Jersey, for instance, Washington executed a daring attack by crossing the icy Delaware River on December 26, 1776, with 2,000 men to attack Hessian mercenaries occupying Trenton. Washington then led his outnumbered Continental Army against British forces near Princeton, New Jersey. When his men wavered in the battle, Washington rode to the front lines, well within range of British muskets, to rally them in a counterattack that secured the victory. Those two battles, Trenton and Princeton, changed the momentum of the whole war. Washington's greatest strategic operation culminated in the last great battle of the American Revolution. The victory at Saratoga had induced the French to form a military alliance with the Americans, and that created a new opportunity. In 1781, Washington initially planned to attack British forces in New York City, but quickly saw a chance to seal a march on the enemy. He spread misinformation, forged documents, and kept watchfires burning while he secretly led 8,000 troops over 400 miles from New York to trap Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington coordinated movements with both the French Army and Navy to prevent British naval reinforcement or evacuation, and orchestrated the formal siege that forced Cornwallis to surrender his entire army. That victory shattered British resolve to continue the war. Washington's greatest act as general occurred after Yorktown, but before the peace treaty of 1783. The Continental Army had not been paid consistently for years due to Congress's financial struggles, and the officers were frustrated by Congress's seeming ingratitude for their service. Some proposed drastic action, refusing to disband, or even marching on Philadelphia to threaten Congress. Washington called a general meeting and then showed up unexpectedly to speak to his officers. He denounced the mutinous talk as subversive, appealing to their patriotism and recalling the last words of the Declaration, "To your own sacred honor." Then, pulling out a pair of glasses to read a letter from Congress, he said, "Gentlemen, you'll permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The conspiracy immediately collapsed. Later that year, Washington's circular address to the states set off a series of events which culminated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Washington was elected its president. Be assured, future President James Monroe reminded another future president, Thomas Jefferson, his influence carried this government. Is it any wonder that Washington was unanimously elected to be the first president of the United States, the arc of Washington's statesmanship was complete. He had led his people from revolution through war to a constitutional republic. Twice during the Revolution, Washington was granted absolute power by Congress to do whatever was necessary for the cause. Twice, he gave that power back. When one of his colonels proposed that Washington be made a king, he rejected the idea in utter disgust. After the war, Washington resigned his military commission. After 2 terms as president, he resigned that too. The French Revolution ended in violence, the guillotine, and the wars of Napoleon. That the American Revolution did not was largely because of Washington, who sought an independent nation of self-governing people, living freely, to use his favorite biblical metaphor, under their own vine and fig tree. The moderation and virtue of a single character, Jefferson later reflected, probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish. When he resigned for the last time, Washington left his beloved country enduring advice in his farewell address: uphold the Constitution, be vigilant in protecting the liberty of all, guard the nation's independence, and above all, maintain the civic and moral character necessary for self-government. George Washington is Pater Patriae, the father of our country, but he never had children of his own. We are his children. Together, we must live up to this inheritance, especially now, on our nation's 250th birthday.
Here we are, pretty much at the beginning of the process here at this pristine, I call it a laboratory. It's not like a factory, it's like a hospital. This is the beginning of the process for roasting. Deep grain, very good quality. Most people don't use this quality. We deal with small farmers because they like to know who we're dealing with. They give us the highest quality, all organic, non-GMO. You should know all Arabica beans, no Robusto, all Arabica. They're going to go into the roaster and it'll get roasted for about 20 minutes or so. Oh my goodness, look at these. My goodness. You're going to want to specially order these. This is what goes into Rudy's coffee.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
The question before us is no longer whether conflict may be avoided, but whether these laws.
There is no year in American history more fabled than 1776. But what happened in the second half of that year is probably the most dramatic roller coaster of historical events of the whole revolution. It's almost impossible to exaggerate the depths to which the fate of Washington and the Continental Army sank that August, or to overstate the triumphant reversal that followed the crossing of the Delaware and the stunning victory at Trenton. But first, we need to know what led up to these events. Of course, the war broke out at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and 2 months later came the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. The British technically won that battle, but the terrible price they paid in blood and lives was one they never would forget. And it was their memory of this that accounts for much that followed, and that would cause them to hesitate when they ought to have pushed forward with everything they had, as we shall see. In March of 1776, Washington and his Continental Army finally chased the British out of Boston. But Washington knew they would regroup and eventually come to New York, and that's exactly what they did. But Washington got there many months before to create the defenses, the fortifications and batteries and breastworks that would be necessary whenever the British did show up. But there was one major problem. New York was a city surrounded by water. It still is. By its vast harbor, and by the East River, and by the Hudson River and the Long Island Sound. And the British had the greatest navy in the world, giving them an insurmountable advantage. The British ships finally appeared over the Atlantic horizon at the end of June, and there seemed to be no end to them. Their sheer numbers were astonishing, meant to strike fear into the hearts of the Americans, which they did. The British knew they could take no chances and must so overwhelm the Americans with the number and force of their warships and troops that the Americans would quickly see they couldn't win and would wisely agree to peace terms as soon as possible. Then it could all be treated as a family quarrel, and the bitter rift between the mother country and her disobedient children could soon be healed. This, at any rate, was the idea of General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe, who'd been deputized by King George not only to win the war, but to bring about peace as soon as possible. Suddenly, it was not a disagreement between King George's British subjects, but between two independent nations. But the Howes still believed they could convince the Americans to give up their silly idea of independence. And so their ships kept coming over the horizon, anchoring in outer New York Harbor off Sandy Hook and Staten Island until by the end of August, there were 400 of them. And the number of troops was 32,000, far more than the roughly 20,000 that Washington had. There were even 8,000 mercenary troops from Germany known as Hessians. Washington knew the British would eventually make their move, but he had no idea where they would strike. Would it be on Long Island and Brooklyn? Or would they strike at the southern end of Manhattan where the city of New York itself was located? Since he had no idea, he hedged his bets by doing what everyone said you should never do, and he split his army between the two places. As it happened, the British struck first on Long Island in southern Brooklyn. Washington thought this might just be a feint to lure his troops there, while most of Howe's forces would then attack Manhattan. But Washington was quite mistaken. General Howe landed 22,000 troops on Long Island. In planning their defense, Washington and his generals decided to defend Brooklyn from what was called the Guan Heights, a ridgeline of several miles running east to west. There were 4 passes through the Guan Heights. The Americans posted troops defending 3 of them. But the 4th pass, called the Jamaica Pass, which was many miles to the east, they left to the patrol of 5 men on horseback. It was precisely there that General Howe chose to strike. Howe and his men then did exactly what they'd hoped to do, marching westward undetected until they were behind Washington's troops. The Americans suddenly found themselves fighting one British force in front and this larger British force from behind. Because the Americans' backs were against the East River, there was no possibility of escaping. But for some reason, Howe ordered his generals to stop. But why? If they'd only kept going, they would have defeated the largest part of Washington's army that day and would have been able to end the rebellion, the entire rebellion, once and for all. There was no need to throw the best of his British troops into a second buzzsaw of destruction and death as at Bunker Hill. No, the British would tighten the noose bit by bit until Washington realized it was over and surrendered. The results would be the same, and dramatically fewer British lives would be lost. And the next morning, a nor'easter blew in with torrential rains. The storm's powerful winds made it impossible for the British ships to sail up the East River to completely trap the Americans as they had expected to do. But the winds also made it impossible for the Americans to get across the East River if they had wished to do so. But they didn't. They chose to stay where they were and to continue to fight. In fact, Washington summoned another 1,000 troops from Manhattan to join him in the fighting in Brooklyn. Among them was General Thomas Mifflin, who, once he'd come over to Brooklyn, decided to inspect the perimeter of the American encampment. When he did so, he observed that the British siege works had advanced considerably. They were only 600 yards away. Washington sent an express rider to order his officers to seize every single boat available up the East River toward the Long Island Sound and up the Harlem River toward the Hudson, and to bring them to the ferry landing in Brooklyn with the utmost urgency. But no one must know about the retreat. The troops would be told to prepare for a night attack. They were told nothing of the retreat. Because if the British caught wind of what was actually happening somehow, they would strike immediately with everything they had, and it would all be over. So that night of August 29th, as soon as it was dark enough, the American officers began moving their regiments one by one toward the ferry landing. It would take many hours to move 9,000 men across a mile-wide churning body of water in the dark. But the northeastern wind that had been blowing for 2 days was still blowing, and it was impossible to cross. 2 hours later, as if on cue, the wind changed. And at 11 p.m. on the night of the 29th, the retreat began. And in perfect darkness and silence, the troops got into the boats and were rowed across the channel. The Massachusetts Marblehead Regiment of Captain Glover, most of whom were professional fishermen and sailors, were indispensable in this. In fact, without them, it would have been perfectly impossible. But as dawn was approaching, Washington saw that everything was moving far too slowly for them to succeed. Many regiments had not even left their lines yet to begin the march to the ferry. And once the sun began to rise, the British would see what they had been blind to all night and would instantly send in their troops. Even worse, they would finally send their ships up the East River now that the winds were again favorable. They would attack the Americans like sitting ducks. But before sunrise, just as the light of dawn began to make things visible, something extraordinary happened. A strange fog settled over the British and American lines. It was so thick that it was absolutely opaque. Benjamin Talmadge, a 22-year-old from Connecticut, remembered it. I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. The fog so veiled everything that even now that the sun rose, the actions of the Americans continued to be perfectly hidden from the British. When all of them had finally arrived safely in Manhattan, the fog lifted. The moment that it did, the British, of course, saw everything and were astonished. The army they knew to be inescapably trapped had escaped after all. The British hustled to the ferry landing and fired their musketry and cannon across the East River. but it was all in vain. The Americans had succeeded in pulling off a spectacular retreat, one that no one on the British side had even imagined. And because of their success in doing so, Washington's army was intact. And the war that should have been over was not over. And the noble cause of independence and liberty was still alive, so that somehow George Washington and the Continental Army would continue to fight.
In order to form a more perfect union.
U.S. Army Major Scott Smiley paid a high price serving our nation. Scott was leading his platoon in Iraq when a blast sent shrapnel through his eyes, leaving him blind and temporarily paralyzed. Scott would become the first blind active duty military officer before medically retiring years later. Thanks to friends like you, the Tunnel to Towers Foundation gave Scott and his family a mortgage-free, specially adapted smart home. Show your support for America's heroes now. Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at t2t.org.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
The tensions with Great Britain had begun to grow in 1763, and they decided to get involved in ruling the colonies more. But the colonies, which had been around for about 150 years at the time, they elected their people, they had town halls, they governed themselves, they thought. And so the tensions started to grow, and they worsened. By the time of the First Continental Congress, it's 1774, and they didn't really have a way to appoint such a Congress, because they had these colonial legislatures, but the king was abolishing them. So they had to write, and they had to talk when they could get together in person. And so what happened was it grew out of these conversations that they had. Just certain leading individuals got appointed by various means, various numbers of them. In the beginning, from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia didn't send anybody at first. So Georgia is absent from the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774. Then in 1775, Georgia did have somebody at the second one. They were all there now. Why did that change? Well, because things were intensifying. The British were beginning to use force, an organized force. The colonists used some force back at them. Boston Tea Party, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, there's fighting going on. And so these people get together. They don't, for the most part, know each other. They may have corresponded. They never met, most of them. And they start figuring out what to do. And it's very important to remember that they are representative. That is to say, they come from a place, from a colony, and they represent the people in the colony. Now, there's various ways they have of being able to claim that. In some sense or another, they are elected from all of them. But it's important to them that they be elected. They don't come because they're well-born. They don't claim that they come because they're rich. They don't claim to be able to be empowered to come because they got an army behind them. They are representatives, and of course that ties to the doctrine of consent of the governed. And they get together and they start talking. And there's a lot of talk. And there's a lot of different opinions. They get together in the State House in Philadelphia. Today we call that Independence Hall. But they get together and they start talking, and they talk, and they argue and argue and argue. John Adams was incredibly important in this thing because he was an early guy who thought we need to build a country. And so they argued themselves around to independence. And that happens in July of 1776. It means they worked on it for almost a year before they came round to that, and they voted for it. They understood that that was a very grave step because it's treason. And these debates are wonderful to read 250 years ago. Many of them suffered from taking the risk. There's a story, it's apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat. Maybe it's even true. A representative by the name of Harrison is said to have said to another representative, "I'm going to have an easier time of it than you. I'm much heavier, and when they hang us, I'll die quicker." They were worried about that. There was soldiers in the field looking for them, to arrest them, take them to England in some cases, on charges of treason, which is a hanging offense. This interplay of war and deliberation is very remarkable thing, because they do form an army in the Second Continental Congress. They took down certain British statues and melted them into bullets. They were getting ready to fight. And that's a contrast between these arguments about whether it's right to fight, what justifies our fighting. See, these people were very ambitious people. There's an ambition to do a great thing, to be a founder. And higher than that is an ambition to do a great thing right, or not do it at all. What should we fight to produce? What will we do after this? Those arguments are rich and interesting and historic, I think, and unprecedented. Lincoln says very beautifully, "A standard maxim for a free society, always to be striven for, always to be sought after, never to be wholly attained." We fall short even today. We have to be moderate in pursuing that perfection because we should know we'll never get it, but we should always keep it in mind and always strive for it. The record of the Second Continental Congress is a deliberation about that, from people risking their lives, and many of them lost their lives. So that's the story of the first great American legislature. It did write the Articles of Confederation, and we did live under it for about 11 years, but it also set in motion the steps that led to the Constitutional Convention that wrote the greatest constitution for a free people ever written. And it wrote, above all else, the Declaration of Independence, which is surely one of the greatest political acts in human history.
Are you ready for some action?
I'm ready for action.
Get the Elite TV plan only through the portal. 218 channels, and it's only $69.95 a month.
Wow.
Including your free portal.
That's cheaper than everyone else.
Your favorite sports, movies, news, even daytime dramas. We're talking about ESPN, OAN, Newsmax, channels you can't get anymore in certain areas.
Compared to the competition, this is a way better deal.
Endless selection. Not to mention all the free music channels. There's over 700 premium and classic movies all ready to go.
Wow.
Plus, they got catch-up TV that allows you to go back and watch what you've missed or want to watch again. Cut your cable in half and get twice as much for free.
Way more channels for half the cost.
After the first year, the subscription then drops to $57.95 monthly, where you change or upgrade anytime. Go to QUXNow.com and get yours today. Use promo code RUDY. Act fast. These deals are selling out.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
There's something about Benjamin Franklin that embodies the soul of America. He's a window into the American mind. It's not a stretch to call him a lawgiver, in the ancient sense, of one who helps to shape the character of a people and their habits. He preached a model of the self-made individual, and he lived that story himself. His life, from his birth in 1706 to his death in 1790, spanned the formation of the American nation as we know it. His self-described rags to riches story begins in Puritan Boston. At the age of 12, he's indentured as a servant to his brother James, who's printer of the New England Courant, a radical paper for the time. He anonymously penned the Silence Do-Good essays. He would slip them under the door of the print shop. And those essays demonstrated his genius and keen insight into different character types. He was impious and funny. In one letter, Silence describes losing her father, who comes above deck to praise God for his safe travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and he's suddenly washed overboard by a huge wave. Franklin was stubborn and even a troublemaker. He liked to argue, to embarrass others in disputes, and especially over religion and politics, and he mocked the Puritan establishment. But Ben's genius cost him, both with the authorities and his brother, who placed Ben in charge of the paper when he was jailed for his politics. James was abusive and often beat his younger brother. And Franklin ran away, breaking the terms. As he puts it in the autobiography, he found himself in New York, nearly 300 miles from home, a boy of 17, but without the least recommendation or knowledge of any person in the place, and with very little money in his pocket. And so, hungry and exhausted, he traveled to Philadelphia. And there he buys 3 bread rolls, and he cuts an iconic figure. He's walking down Market Street, eating one of those bread rolls with another tucked under each arm. As an 18-year-old, he embarked on a trip to London to acquire printing materials. But he found himself betrayed, without credit, and stranded. And while he learned much in London, Franklin was unsettled with the elements of his life. He records them as errata in his autobiography. He asked how he could be truly happy and achieve the greatest perfection possible. At the age of 20, he wrote a plan of conduct on his voyage home to guide his future behavior, with the goal of becoming, as he says, both good and great, both happy and esteemed in society. Calls it the favor of God and man. Ambition, he concluded, must be educated by a steady resolution to both industry and frugality. It required a material basis. And so rather than war against human nature, Franklin sought to cultivate it as one would a garden. And he gives the same example for Philadelphia, which he compares to a garden. After acquiring the Pennsylvania Gazette, one of only 2 papers in the city, he launched the successful Poor Richard's Almanac. He included famous sayings to educate his readers, such as, "Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." To succeed in this new world, different virtues would be needed. And Franklin constructed a list of ancient Christian and commercial virtues. He combined them, and then he also added a method to achieve them. But importantly, he couldn't do it all alone. Humans, he wrote, were social creatures, both naturally selfish as well as benevolent. And the self-interested desires for profit and praise could be channeled into public projects that benefited everyone. He helped to found the Junto, a group of young citizens who met to discuss philosophy, morals, and public improvement. They would present papers before everyone at their meetings. Thus, Franklin embodies another American ideal of civic associations, which forms the foundation of self-government and Republican habits. He helped to initiate a vibrant civil society, a subscription library, a fire brigade, a fire insurance company, the academy, a hospital, and a militia. He also embodies the American love affair with science. When he achieved leisure and retired early, Franklin turned to the study of the natural world, including what he called electrical fluid, famous kite experiment with lightning. His experiments introduced terms like battery and positive and negative charges that we use today. But Franklin always insisted that questions of truth be connected with the human good. For example, knowledge of airflow to create a superior stove, the Franklin stove for heating homes. Knowledge of electricity to create lightning rods to prevent fires and death. Knowledge of the Gulf Stream to expedite travel across the Atlantic. His ideas about government included all the elements of the future American Republic. John Adams said that after reading Franklin's 1751 observations on the increase of mankind, he knew that separation from Britain was inevitable. James Madison said that Franklin's 1754 letters to William Shirley comprised the, quote, germ of American federalism. Franklin is including essays describing the separation of powers, the lawmaking authority, delegation doctrine. In 1747, during King George's War, Franklin was in his 40s at the time. He applied his views of social contract to found the association. It was an extra-legal militia to defend Pennsylvania from French pirates and hostile Indian tribes. Franklin was a soldier. We often don't think of him that way. In 1751, Franklin was elected to the Assembly. He sat on all of its standing committees. He drafted bills and responses to the governor during the tumultuous French and Indian War. Recognized for his party that disputed with the Pennsylvania proprietors over the rights of the legislature. He insisted on equality, that the laws must be for the good of the whole, as the foundation for justice was the good of the whole as opposed to the interests of a few. Under a new militia bill, Franklin was elected a colonel by the soldiers themselves, and he led an expedition to build forts on the frontier. In 1757, Franklin was sent by the Assembly to England. There he's involved in the attempt to repeal the proprietary charter and to replace it with the royal charter. He thought he was entering the last act of his life, 1756, and he had reason to be ambitious. He had been made the Deputy Postmaster General of British North America, and he aspired to be governor over a new colony in Ohio. But his mission to make Pennsylvania a royal colony faded in relief to growing quarrels over taxation with Parliament. And Franklin wrote volumes of articles to defend the colonial rights to consent to tax measures. And so from 1768 to 1770, he was appointed agent for Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. He would always be an outsider in the British aristocratic society. And it all came to a head in 1773. Having secretly obtained letters from Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, he wanted to blame the imperial disputes on Hutchinson. Franklin sent them to leaders in the Massachusetts Assembly, but when the letters created a scandal, he had to admit that he had sent them. And so in the cockpit, where Henry VIII had watched cockfights, Franklin was mocked for a solid hour by Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn. Very witty, and he did this in front of all of the British lords. And so Franklin stood there, stone-faced, silent, refusing to respond. And so Franklin's career in Britain was over. He lost his position as postmaster, and he returned to Pennsylvania in 1775. But he displayed another American characteristic. He reinvented himself. Removing himself from public business for about a month, he met with those with whom he had been closest. Joseph Galloway in the Pennsylvania Assembly, and his own son William, who was governor of New Jersey. And the three stayed up late drinking, and Franklin then openly announced he was for independence. Neither agreed, and it would be the end of their relationships. As a Tory, William encouraged acts of terror against patriot towns, and Benjamin refused to intervene to release him from prison, his own son. Now Franklin took every opportunity he could to further the break between the two nations. He reorganized the postal system, this is all at the age of 70, and served on committees that oversaw petitions to the king, the manufacture of saltpeter for gunpowder, the printing of paper currency, colonial arms and defenses, Indian affairs, foreign affairs. Franklin drafted the Articles of Confederation. He was also reelected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. He was president of its constitutional convention, probably the most radical of all the new state constitutions, the 1776 Constitution that had unicameral legislature. His eyes were so tired he could hardly write at night, and eventually he resigned from several of those committees. But in February 1776, he traveled on a failed frozen mission to entice Canada to revolt with the colonies. He assumed he would die on the journey. It was Franklin's international reputation as a natural philosopher that proved most useful for American diplomacy. He gained access to leading men in foreign nations, Spain, Holland, France, to secretly fund the war. In June 1776, his French friend Jacques Barbeau de Bourg secured a shipment of arms. The United States was caught between a rock and a hard place. It must declare independence to receive aid from France, but it must receive aid to declare independence. And Franklin was on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Franklin made some key changes to Jefferson's draft. He changed the words sacred and inviolable. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Franklin added. He changed Jefferson's words, reduce them to arbitrary power, to reduce them under absolute despotism. And in his final key role, he accepted the mission to France. Franklin returned home in 1785. His last years were in public service, as much as he wanted to retire. He was elected to 3 consecutive terms as governor and was a delegate to the 1787 Constitutional Convention. He endorsed the new Constitution not as a perfect document, but perhaps as the best that the founders were able. And finally, he made a motion, which was not passed, for the clergy of the city of Philadelphia to lead the remaining sessions in prayer, lest the founders become, he says, like the builders of Babel. He said that during the Revolution, the same men had prayed for unity, but now they mistakenly thought they could found a nation without divine aid. And it was a comment on the necessity of a pre-political faith and loyalty, a common belief that binds a people together and transcends their partisan interests. Finally, Franklin agreed to be president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. Its 1790 petition brought heated debate in Congress. For a man who had owned slaves and servants, it was a fitting end to a life that embodied Republican ideals of equality, liberty, and self-reliance. Franklin was a true genius, a self-made man, a fervent Republican, and a man instrumental to the founding of the nation he so dearly loved.
U.S. Army Major Scott Smiley paid a high price serving our nation. Scott was leading his platoon in Iraq when a blast sent shrapnel through his eyes. leaving him blind and temporarily paralyzed. Scott would become the first blind active duty military officer before medically retiring years later. Thanks to friends like you, the Tunnel to Towers Foundation gave Scott and his family a mortgage-free, specially adapted smart home. Show your support for America's heroes now. Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at t2t.org.
In order to form a more perfect union.
House divided. Worthy and devotionally principle.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Just over 231,000 men served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and only 48,000 ever served at the same time. How many can you name? George Washington probably comes to mind. Maybe Hamilton, Lafayette. If you're a real history buff, you might remember Nathaniel Greene or John Stark. How about all the others? Who remembers the ordinary soldiers who won our independence? I'm Michael Knowles, and I remember one of those soldiers. Not because he led a famous regiment or went on to hold any high office. There's no monument to his service other than a small headstone in a far-flung cemetery with a simple four-word epitaph: Soldier of the Revolution. And I remember that soldier because he's my great-great-great-great-grandpa, Simon Knowles. Like most Continental soldiers, Simon's name appears in the appendix of a history book. If not for a single Army pension application, written almost 50 years after the fact, no one would know a thing about his service. But Providence and Congress so arranged things that we do know about his service, and the service of tens of thousands of his fellow rank-and-file soldiers. Simon signed up to fight at the tender age of 15, and he served throughout the entire war. From the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, across the Delaware with Washington to the battles of Trenton, Princeton, and Saratoga. Through the bitter winter at Valley Forge, all the way through final victory at Yorktown, and then to an honorable discharge once again with Washington at Newburgh in 1783. After the war, Simon, like most of his fellow veterans, became a farmer. He didn't own much. His estate comprised a heifer, a sword from his father, and a walking cane. Personal effects, all of the value of $1. This relative poverty, common among the men who won the Revolution, was a hardship for him, but a blessing to us, because it prompted these patriots to detail their service in official government documents in exchange for a modest stipend in their old age. But money was never a top priority for these men. The teenagers and 20-somethings who enlisted and re-enlisted in the Continental Army might have done so with the promise of pay, but that pay rarely came on time. Even when it did, it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. A wagon load of Continental dollars would hardly buy a wagon load of provisions. The men were paid as though they were volunteers, but they were expected to fight like a professional army. General Stark trained his men in the finer points of warfare, including the bayonet, which astonished the Hessians in the surprise attack at Trenton. Hessian survivors recounted that the American troops charged with a ferocity and discipline more characteristic of elite European forces than of a ragtag New World militia. These ordinary soldiers' skill in battle was all the more impressive, given the fact that they were usually starving. At Valley Forge, during the winter of 1777 to 1778, meat and bread all but disappeared. The men lived on fire cakes, flour and water paste, for days on end. The most common refrain from the feeble huts that lined the camp was, "No meat." Joseph Plum Martin was 17 years old when he encamped at Valley Forge. Oftentimes, he wrote, "Have I gone 1, 2, 3, even 4 days without a morsel, unless the fields or forests might chance to afford enough to prevent absolute starvation. Often, when I have picked the last grain from the bones of my scanty morsel, have I eat the very bones, as much of them as possibly could be eaten, and then have had to perform some hard and fatiguing duty." 1 in 6 soldiers died that winter. Those who survived the bullets and bayonets of the British, as well as the constant malnutrition, disease, dysentery, typhus, smallpox, and exposure. General Washington reported that by late December of that year, not less than 2,898 men were unfit for duty by reason of their being barefoot and otherwise naked. Many couldn't walk on their frost-bitten feet. And Valley Forge wasn't even the coldest winter. 2 years later, during the winter of 1779 to 1780, 1 sentry froze to death at his post in Morristown, New Jersey. When the Continental soldiers weren't freezing, they were dropping from heat stroke. At the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, countless soldiers collapsed, and dozens died from heat exhaustion. One sergeant recalled that the sun-baked soldiers drank from mud puddles as they ducked British cannonballs. But the endless suffering was only one part of the story, and the minor part at that. The crucial fact of that battle, of the whole revolution really, was that the Americans stood their ground. Before the British slunk away, the Patriots had proved that they could face the finest army on earth in open battle, despite an incomparable disadvantage in training and supplies. Unfortunately, the morale boost did not improve material conditions on the ground. When soldiers ran out of food in Maine during Colonel Arnold's expedition to Quebec, they boiled leather for soup. After 7 days, with no kind of nourishment but roots and black birch bark, Private William Beggs recalled, his party of soldiers ate a stray horse, and they were lucky to have found it. On the Sullivan Campaign in 1779, soldiers had to settle for horse feed, as overstretched supply lines reduced them to half rations without flour. And still, they managed to rout Tory Rangers and their Iroquois allies at the Battle of Newtown, a major military victory, albeit one that cost them their clothes. One private, Nathan Davis, recalled that his uniform had been cut to rags by marching through woods and thickets. Many men walked bare-chested. The lucky ones wore Indian leggings. Some wore little more than loincloths. But they had broken the Indian strength and advanced the Army's campaign. Occasionally, troops mutinied. Who could blame them? But most did not. In Simon's New Hampshire line, no major mutiny ever broke out. These men had not signed up for good food, warm clothes, or pity parties. But they enlisted with a purpose: to defend their country. And the defense of one's country entails sacrifice. Modern people sometimes struggle to believe that others are not as cynical as they themselves. They believe that all human action must derive from selfish, material interest. The ordinary soldiers who signed up to fight for American independence confound these cynics, because they didn't stand to gain much of anything, at least materially, for their troubles. What motivated them was more valuable: honor, virtue, ideals. Ensign Samuel Cooper wrote to his wife in July 1775, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, your father was a coward." These soldiers took leave of their families, some of whom disagreed even with the cause of independence. They endured and overcame their hardships for, in the words of Massachusetts soldier James Davenport, liberty, peace, and independence forever. If the soldiers had one fear, it was the indifference of their countrymen. that their sacrifices would be in vain, and their cause soon forgotten. At Valley Forge, Dr. Albigence Waldo described the dread in his diary. "There comes a soldier. He comes and cries, 'I fail fast, I shall soon be no more, and all the reward I shall get will be, poor Will is dead.'" In 1780, the Continental Congress voted to give a reward, at least to officers who had served in the Revolution. Half pay for life, a courtesy later amended to full pay for 5 years. The ordinary soldier, on the other hand, returned home with next to nothing. Worthless promissory notes and a pat on the back. It took an additional 38 years, and for most soldiers more than half a century, for Congress finally to offer a reward to the destitute veterans who had not already died. Even in their old age and penury, these veterans once again gave their country a greater gift than anything they received in return. They told us who they were and what they did, and not one of their names was ordinary. No man is ordinary. Each man suffers and delights, fails and triumphs in his own way. Or, in the words of the poet of the Revolution, Philip Freneau, "Far, far from domes where splendid tapers glare, 'tis his from dear-bought peace no wealth to win, removed alike from courtly cringing squires, the great man's levy and the proud man's grin. Sold are those arms which once on Britons blazed, when, flushed with conquest, to the charge they came. That power repelled, and freedom's fabric raised, she leaves her soldier, famine, and a name."
In order to form a more perfect union.
Where they can get most of these countries.
To each other, our lives, our fortune.
It's our purpose to bring to bear the principle of common sense and rational discussion to the issues of our day. America was created at a time of great turmoil, tremendous disagreements, anger, hatred. There was a book written in 1776 that guided much of the discipline of thinking that brought to us the discovery of our freedoms, of our God-given freedoms. It was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, one of the first American bestsellers, in which Thomas Paine explained, by rational principles, the reason why these small colonies felt the necessity to separate from the Kingdom of Great Britain and the King of England. He explained their inherent desire for liberty, for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the ability to select the people who govern them. And he explained it in ways that were understandable to all the people, not just the elite. Because the desire for freedom is universal. The desire for freedom adheres in the human mind, and it is part of the human soul. This is exactly the time we should consult our history. Look at what we've done in the past and see if we can't use it to help us now. We understand that our founders created the greatest country in the history of the world, the greatest democracy, the freest country, a country that has taken more people out of poverty than any country ever. All of us are so fortunate to be Americans. But a great deal of the reason for America's constant ability to self-improve is because we're able to reason We're able to talk. We're able to analyze. We are able to apply our God-given common sense. So let's do it.
General Thomas Gage, the British commander, decided to act. The British plan was to seize the hills at Dorchester to the south and then launch an assault against Bunker Hill. The Dorchester attack was planned for the morning of June 18th, without much concern as to what General Ward's troops might be doing in the interim. For 2 days before this planned attack, at the urging of Prescott and Putnam, Ward agreed to fortify the Charleston Peninsula and its 110-foot high point of Bunker Hill. Putnam, who was itching for an all-out fight with the British, pushed for the construction of the main fortifications on a slightly lower knoll closer to Boston that would later be called Breed's Hill. On the rebel side, Ward's soldiers were still less an army than a loose band of partisans. Hardy in the cause, as one termed it. Few had uniforms. Most were in everyday work clothes. All carried muskets brought from home. Some of the weapons were older than the men who shouldered them. Almost no one had bayonets. The crude earthworks they dug on Breed's Hill were relatively small, about 130 feet square. The main weakness was that its northern slopes fell gently toward the Mystic River, offering an avenue from which an attack could surround the position and cut it off. When the British discovered the rebel position on the morning of June 17th, General Gage postponed his Dorchester plans and expedited his attack against Bunker Hill. Cannon from Royal Navy ships in the Charles River and batteries atop Copp's Hill in Boston pummeled the newly constructed rebel positions. And General Gage ordered General William Howe to attack that very afternoon. Watching from atop Copp's Hill, General Gage handed his telescope to Abijah Willard, a loyalist who had sought safety in Boston, and asked if he recognized anyone among the rebels who might be in command. Willard did. William Prescott was a fellow soldier from the colonial wars, as well as his brother-in-law. Will he fight? Gage demanded. He could not answer for Prescott's men, Willard replied, but Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell. Now came the stuff of legend. Howe ordered 1,500 men to cross the Charles River. They landed unopposed on the beach below Bunker Hill. Prescott's men in their trenches were content to watch because they were short of gunpowder. Howe formed his troops on a rise about 100 yards inland, but what he saw next gave him pause. Colonel John Stark's 1st New Hampshire Regiment, about 400 men, had taken up positions behind a rail fence and a hastily erected stone barricade on the Mystic Beach, anchoring Prescott's vulnerable left flank. Seeing this massing of rebel troops, Howe sent for reinforcements. By the time they arrived, he had about 2,200 men in the field against likely half that number in the immediate vicinity. For one fleeting moment, the difference between Lexington and what was about to occur below Bunker Hill stood in sharp relief. This could not be called an accidental encounter. As General Howe's troops advanced toward Prescott's and Stark's positions, late on the afternoon of June 17, 1775, it was clear to any observer that the outcome would be a pitched battle. As British troops advanced uphill in 2 long lines and in column against Stark's position, the bulk of the American line stood silent, keenly aware of its limited gunpowder. "Hold your fire," commanders reminded their men. The quote, most associated with the Battle of Bunker Hill, is "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Now, who said it? Perhaps William Prescott, or how often it was repeated is uncertain. Another account claims that behind the stone barricade, John Stark admonished his men not to fire until they could see the enemy's white-colored gaiters. Onward then, Howe's regulars came. At perhaps 50 yards, the command "Fire" resounded, and the entire rebel line exploded with a thunderous roar. The British troops staggered and fell back in disarray. Howe ordered them to reform and move forward again. Armchair strategists have faulted Howe for marching his troops directly up Bunker Hill. But this frontal maneuver was not Howe's initial intent. He had placed great faith in his light infantry to turn the left end of the rebel line and create havoc along it. After that, the heavy grenadier companies were to bulldoze through with fixed bayonets. 11 companies of light infantry, about 350 men, rushed headlong in a column of fours against the stone barricade, where Stark's New Hampshire men stood 3 deep. Their first volley decimated the attacking column. As other companies moved forward to take his place, they gained no more than a few yards before more volleys rent the air. The British infantry struggled onward, but the New Hampshire lads stood firm as granite. The grenadier companies on the slope above heard these musket volleys without seeing the results. Howe indeed intended for the grenadiers to sweep through the rebel line and circle behind the trenches. But as the light infantry attack collapsed, the grenadiers too were thwarted by concentrated fire. After the second attack also failed, Howe ordered a third charge directly against the earthen fortifications. By now, the rebels were dangerously low on gunpowder. Many had withdrawn to the higher hilltop of Bunker Hill. Prescott was down to about 150 men. What ended resistance there was neither a lack of courage nor unstoppable British resolve, but rather a shortage of gunpowder. The remaining defenders lost their lives to British bayonets. By evening, the Charleston Peninsula was in British hands, but the rebels had fought a fighting withdrawal and established defensive lines. On the British side, there was a dazed sense of disbelief. The slopes were littered with red uniforms of the dead and dying. General Howe was in denial. He had won the field, but at a staggering cost. The Battle of Bunker Hill was, his fellow General Henry Clinton opined, a dear-bought victory. Another such would have ruined us. After Bunker Hill, there was no doubt that this was all-out war. Some suggest the military importance of Bunker Hill is overstated. Yet American history.
It's our purpose to bring to bear the principle of common sense and rational discussion to the issues of our day. America was created at a time of great turmoil, tremendous disagreements, anger, hatred. It was a book written in 1776 that guided much of the discipline of thinking that brought to us the discovery of our freedoms, of our God-given freedoms. It was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, one of the first American bestsellers, in which Thomas Paine explained, by rational principles, the reason why these small colonies felt the necessity to separate from the Kingdom of Great Britain and the King of England. He explained their inherent desire for liberty, for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the ability to select the people who govern them. And he explained it in ways that were understandable to all the people, not just the elite. Because the desire for freedom is universal. The desire for freedom adheres in the human mind, and it is part of the human soul. This is exactly the time we should consult our history. Look at what we've done in the past and see if we can't use it to help us now. We understand that our founders created the greatest country in the history of the world, the greatest democracy, the freest country, a country that has taken more people out of poverty than any country ever. All of us are so fortunate to be Americans. But a great deal of the reason for America's constant ability to self-improve is because we're able to reason, we're able to talk, we're able to analyze. We are able to apply our God-given common sense. So let's do it.